Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Blue Water Navy 2020 update. We have some news to share with you about what's going on with Blue Water Navy cases at the VA. My name is Robert Chisholm from Chisholm and Kilpatrick. Joining me today is Courtney Ross and Brad Hennings, and we're going to be talking about Blue Water Navy. So first, a little background information. The Blue Water Navy Act of 2019 did the following. It permitted veterans aboard a vessel operating not more than 12 nautical miles seaward of the line of demarcation, commencing on the southwestern demarcation line of the waters of Vietnam and Cambodia, and intersecting coordinates listed in the Act are now eligible for the presumption of herbicide exposure. Previously denied claimants may be eligible for retroactive benefits if they had filed in the past and they were denied. We're going to go into that in a little bit more detail. But Courtney, we've been doing some digging at the VA to try and discover how they're handling these claims. And can you sort of talk to us a little bit about what we've learned and, more importantly, how we've learned?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Robert. So we obtained a lot of the information that we are going to be talking about today through a request under the Freedom of Information Act, or what we call FOIA. And essentially, FOIA is a law that allows the public to request access to records that are held by federal agencies. And federal agencies like VA have to disclose the information unless it falls under one of 9 different exemptions under the law that typically deal with privacy or security concerns. So we submitted a request to VA for documents that were related to how VA was planning to adjudicate Blue Water Navy claims. And what we received back was a number of documents, including training documents and policy documents that helped us create an outline of the way that VA is planning to adjudicate these claims. And what was clear is that there's multiple layers to the adjudication. And so that's what we're going to walk through today. But the first thing is that there's 8 designated regional offices that these Blue Water Navy claims are going to be adjudicated at. So the VA's National Work Queue is going to route all of the Blue Water Navy claims that are filed to these 8 specific regional offices. It includes St. Louis, Cleveland, Waco, St. Paul, Roanoke, St. Petersburg, Phoenix, and lastly, Salt Lake City.
So let's say in Providence, Rhode Island, where we actually are, and we're not in one of those regional offices. How does that work?
So the claim will be filtered to the National Work Queue once it's noted as a Blue Water Navy claim, and they will designate it and send it to one of these 8 specific regional offices.
And the idea is that these 8 specific regional offices will have teams that have expertise in this. Is that the idea?
Exactly. So they're what's called centralized processing teams. And so the initial regional office has a very limited role in that it is responsible for the initial processing of the claim, as well as gathering service records. But from there, it gets sent to the central processing team that's going to be responsible for reviewing the military records and additional development.
And Brad, can you sort of share what we've learned about these central processing teams and how they operate at these specific regional offices?
Yes. So the centralized processing teams, they're designed to ensure that appropriate development is complete and determine if the presumption of exposure can be conceded. So what these teams are doing is they're using the Veterans Benefits Administration's ship locator tool, which leverages Navy and Coast Guard deck logs, coordinate data. They're using that tool to determine whether the claimant falls in under the presumption. So the centralized processing team is responsible for ensuring that there's evidence of a condition that can be granted under the regulatory presumption. They determine if the veteran had duty or visitation on the ground in Vietnam. They determine if the veteran's ship served in a qualifying bay or harbor for the Blue Water veterans. They ensure that all the military records have been requested and obtained. And then they send a subsequent development letter to the claimant requesting additional service details if that's required. So the main bays and harbors within the eligible offshore waters that confer this presumption of herbicide exposure include Cameron Bay, Da Nang Harbor, and Nha Trang Harbor. There's a number of other bays and harbors that are included, but those are three of the biggest ones that we typically see claimants come to us, veterans come to us and say, hey, I served on a ship that was in one of these places, and now they're covered by this blue water herbicide presumption.
So if they're in the 12-mile limit, or they're in one of the harbors that we just mentioned and the other ones, then VA is going to concede herbicide exposure. And the claim will move along fairly quickly, assuming they can make that determination. But not everyone's going to fall into those categories. Is there a process, Courtney, for when someone doesn't when VA is investigating this and doing their analysis, when they don't meet that criteria, at least initially?
Yes, so this is another layer of it. So if the centralized processing team has gone through the process that Brad just described and are still unable to concede exposure to herbicides, the case will then be sent to what's called a records research specialist team. And essentially this team is responsible for doing a little bit more digging and additional research to see if they can place the veteran within the 12 nautical miles under the law. So this team is responsible for, one, making sure that all of the development that the centralized processing team is responsible for has already been done. And then they will do additional research using other tools, including 7 approved tools already approved by the Veterans Benefits Administration. It includes things like muster rolls, command history reports, documents from the National Archives and Records Administration, often referred to as NARA, Navy cruise books. They'll do additional research into deck logs. They'll consult with military services. Basically, they're responsible for documenting and making evidence-based determinations for ship locations if the centralized processing team was unable to do so in their initial review.
We can imagine that the VA is handling all of these claims, and that a number of these veterans had previously filed claims, Brad. And so now, let's say someone filed a claim initially in, just for the sake of this, 1996, right? And they were in a vessel that was within the 12 nautical miles. And now it's 2020 and they have an opportunity to file a new claim. What kind of a claim do they file, first of all, because we're in the AMA world now? And then 2, how does retroactive payment work, or is it supposed to work here?
So a claimant or a veteran in that particular case would want to file a supplemental claim for the same condition that was covered by that prior claim, let's say, that was filed in 1986. So the rule is that you have to have filed an explicit claim and been denied benefits for disability due to a lack of evidence of Vietnam service between September 25th, 1985 and January 1st, 2020. And if that's the case and you file a supplemental claim and it is granted now because you fall in under the blue water presumption, your effective date will go back as early as that initial claim, in your example, as far back as 1986. However, it's crucially important that a veteran file one of these supplemental claims in order to get that retroactive date. Under the famous Niemer case having to do with herbicide exposure, VA on its own went back through cases and assigned retroactive effective dates. But in the current legislation, the Blue Water Navy legislation, it requires the veteran itself to take affirmative action to file a supplemental claim, and then VA will potentially take it back as far as that initial claim that was denied perhaps 20 years ago.
So veterans can't just wait for VA to adjudicate these claims. They need to file a supplemental claim if they haven't done so already.
Exactly. VA is not going to do it on their own. They need a trigger to go in and reinvestigate that. And the trigger in this case is filing a supplemental claim. So I can't emphasize enough how important that is to file that supplemental claim.
Over the years, when we've been representing veterans at CCK, And let's start with the veterans who stated that they served in country in Vietnam and were therefore eligible for the presumption, but there was no service record of the veteran actually serving in country. And sometimes we would have to get affidavits, sometimes we'd get buddy statements to prove service in country in Vietnam. We can imagine that there will be some veterans who will be denied under the Blue Water Navy Act because they can't prove, or the records, this process that we've just outlined, doesn't show that this particular veteran was on a boat or a vessel within the 12-mile limit. Those veterans, what will they have to show then if this process that VA's developed doesn't prove that they're entitled to the presumption? Is that the end of the claim for them, or what should those veterans do?
Veterans could also, similar to what you were saying about what we've done historically in cases where veterans have said they've served on land and we've had to do additional development because there's nothing in the record clearly indicating that, I think you can apply that same process for Blue Water Navy veterans. VA's process may not have been able to locate a record placing them within those 12 nautical miles. But if you can gather lay testimony from the veteran, perhaps from others that he served with that can also attest to, how far from shore they were, even if they can recall, maybe seeing the shore in a distance, information like that can be helpful, and you can still use it for Blue Water Navy claims as we've done in the past with boots on the ground Vietnam claims.
I think that I agree completely with what Courtney said. I think the lay evidence can be very powerful. For example, because sometimes the records just don't cover every possible circumstance, and you can use that lay evidence to fill the evidentiary gap to show the presumption. And I think it is very powerful if you can say, yeah, our ship steamed in and I could see the shore and it looked like it was about 3 miles away. In the absence of anything else, that can be enough.
And so it's important for veterans not to give up if VA says we can't prove the ship or the vessel was within the 12 nautical miles. If they can provide lay statements, buddy statements, other evidence that could fill that gap potentially, because VA has to consider lay evidence at the end of the day. Okay, so what have we seen so far in the way VA has been adjudicating the blue water claims? What are we learning?
One last part of this process is after, if the claim goes to the records research team and they're unable to verify exposure to the herbicide, the last step in the process is that they will send it to the Joint Services Records Research Center, or what you might hear referred to as JSRC, for additional research and search for records to try to place the veteran within the 12 nautical miles. And what we've recently learned is that JSRC is actually closed indefinitely due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we're seeing an increase in wait times for Blue Water Navy and other cases where, a veteran's case might be at that point in the process where VA is trying to get records from JSRC because of the current closure of that office.
The other thing I think, and this is true with most VA claims, and that is if it's really obvious where your ship was, if they have really good records that show you were within the 12-mile demarcation line, VA has been pretty good about adjudicating those in a timely manner, granting the benefits that the veteran's entitled to and moving along. It's those cases where it's not so clear, where the evidence isn't cut and dry. And those are the cases that you typically have to appeal and take longer, and it's important to have the lay evidence. And I think it's really important to have a representative who can help frame your story, frame the claim, frame the narrative to make VA understand why you're entitled.
We've really been talking about presumptive conditions, so those conditions that VA has already identified as where it's applicable for presumptive service connection to apply if you can show the exposure and the diagnosis of the condition. But this law could also help veterans who might have conditions that can be caused by herbicides but aren't necessarily on VA's presumptive list. So I'll use hypertension as a common example. If a veteran has a diagnosis of hypertension and can show that they were within the 12 nautical miles, and you can get a medical nexus linking the two, the law can also help you, or the new law can also help veterans. It just won't be presumptive service connection. It's now direct service connection, and you need that medical nexus part. But you no longer need to show the exposure piece is different under the new law, is what I mean, if you can place yourself within those 12 nautical miles. So just to keep that in mind as well, if you have conditions that you think are due to herbicide, but might not be on the presumptive list.
Right, and I think that's a really good point, Courtney, because we've been able to successfully represent veterans who were conceded exposed, but have a medical condition that's not one of the presumptive conditions. And as you point out, you have to get a expert medical opinion in order to win those kinds of cases.
My biggest thought or piece of advice is to hang in there. Be patient. This is a long slog with some of these claims. Sometimes with VA, again, when it's not cut and dry, VA really struggles with those kinds of cases. But you need to be patient. Find a representative, find an accredited VSO, like our friends at the DAV, or an accredited attorney or agent. Have them help you prepare your claim, prepare your appeal, and again, just hang in there.
Courtney, Brad, thank you both for joining today. This is Robert Chisholm from cck-law.com. Continue to follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and check our website. We continually update as we learn new things. And thank you for joining us today.